Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, we love to dig into listener suggestions, and well, this one's a doozy. You sent in this amazing podcast episode all about the Chicano movement, and wow, it really it got us thinking.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating movement, and I think we can all learn something new today.
Definitely. Okay, so Chicano movement, huge in the 60s and 70s, fighting for Mexican-American rights, cultural pride, the whole thing. But before we get into like the nitty-gritty of the movement itself, what was going on in America that like made this movement so necessary? What was the climate like?
Well, you can't just look at the 60s. You know, it's not like it just appeared overnight. This was the result of decades, generations really, of just systemic discrimination against Mexican Americans. I mean, imagine being kept from voting, you know, segregated schools, public spaces, stuck in terrible jobs, no chance of moving up. This was the reality for so many people.
It's like you're describing a powder keg just waiting for that spark.
Exactly. And while, you know, lots of folks connect the Chicano movement with César Chávez and the farm workers' struggle, you know, the roots of this movement run so much deeper. Local communities were already organizing and demanding change way before Chavez, you know, became the figure we know.
So beyond Chavez, where do we see these early signs? Like, what's a story that really captures this energy, this building frustration?
Let's go to Crystal City, Texas in 1963. Small-town Mexican Americans are the majority, but they have zero political power, completely shut out by this Anglo elite.
Wow, that's infuriating, right? You're the majority, but you have no say.
Right. And a group of Tejano activists, a lot of them tied to labor unions, decided enough is enough.
Yeah.
They organized, they mobilized voters, and they pulled off this incredible victory. They elected an all-Mexican-American city council.
Wow. Talk about David and Goliath.
Oh, yeah. It was a huge deal. Of course, the Anglo establishment didn't just, you know, roll over. There were attempts to sabotage the new council intimidation tactics, the whole 9 yards. But the people of Crystal City held their ground, and their victory sent shockwaves across the Southwest. Suddenly, everyone was like, hey, look what's possible when we fight back.
Man, I'm already hooked on this story, okay? And here's something that's always fascinated me about this movement. The word Chicano itself, you know, it was originally like a derogatory term, almost a slur. So how did it get transformed into this badge of honor? Like how they flipped the script on that?
Yeah, it's a classic example of reclaiming your identity, right?
Yeah.
In the 60s, activists, they took ownership of that word Chicano. They turned it into this symbol of defiance of pride in their heritage.
It's so brilliant. It's like taking back the power to define yourself.
Exactly. They weren't going to let others define them. You know,
Yeah.
They celebrated their indigenous roots. They incorporated Aztec imagery. They rallied under slogans like La Raza, which means the race. You know, it was this powerful way of saying, we're here, we have a history, and we're not going anywhere.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it. And it seems like this idea of reclaiming identity, it pops up in a lot of social movements, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a recurring theme. You see it time and time again. When people take control of their own narrative and define themselves on their own terms.
Well, the thing that really struck me about the Chicano movement was their political savvy.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't just protesting, they were organizing, they were playing the long game, you know?
Yeah, they understood that real lasting change, it comes from political power. And one of their boldest moves was the formation of La Raza Unida Party in 1970.
Okay, now that's a name that commands attention. Tell me more about La Raza Unida.
So the driving force behind it was this guy, José Ángel Gutiérrez. He was a real firebrand. He'd already made waves with MAYO, the Mexican-American Youth Organization. Gutierrez was all about action. He wanted radical change. And with La Raza Unida, their goal was crystal clear. Increase Mexican-American political power. They ran candidates. They fought for bilingual education, labor rights, healthcare, you name it. They were tackling it head on.
Okay, so they had this bold vision, a clear plan, but did everyone in the Chicano movement agree with this approach?
Well, you know, working within the system, it can be slow, it can be frustrating, and some activists felt like La Raza Unida was maybe too accommodating, too willing to compromise. There were definitely, you know, tensions, disagreements within the movement about the best way to get things done.
That's so interesting, right? Because it reminds us that even within a movement, you have these different perspectives, different strategies. So tell me, what kind of impact did La Raza Unida actually have? Did they make a dent?
Well, they did. They actually won several elections in Texas and other states. These were major upsets. It showed they were a force to be reckoned with, and it forced mainstream politicians to pay attention. But beyond, you know, winning elections, I think their biggest impact was how they inspired a whole generation of activists. They showed what was possible when a community organized and really flexed its political muscle.
Well, we've talked about some of the big names, right? Chavez, Gutierrez. But I'm curious, are there any lesser-known figures who really stand out to you? People whose contributions maybe haven't gotten as much attention, but were still really crucial?
Oh, there are so many unsung heroes in this movement.
Yeah.
But let's focus on three individuals who I think were particularly important. César Chávez, José Ángel Gutiérrez, and Rodolfo Corky Gonzales. Now, we've already touched on Chávez's work with the United Farm Workers, but it's important to connect that to the broader Chicano movement. You see, he wasn't just fighting for better wages and working conditions. He was fighting for the dignity and recognition of Mexican Americans as a vital part of American society.
Right. It was about so much more than just the fields. It was about cultural pride, about uplifting an entire community. What about José Ángel Gutiérrez? We talked about his political activism, but what else made him so influential?
Well, Gutierrez was this incredible organizer. He had this knack for connecting with people, inspiring them to action. And his founding of MAYO, the Mexican American Youth Organization, it was genius. He understood that the youth, they were the future of the movement, and he empowered them to become leaders.
So he was thinking long-term, building a movement for the future. What about Rodolfo Corky Gonzales? His name keeps coming up as a key figure.
Gonzales was a powerful voice for the movement, particularly in Denver, Colorado, where he founded the Crusade for Justice. But his most enduring legacy might be his poem, I Am Joaquin. It became this rallying cry for the Chicano movement, this beautiful and poignant expression of their struggle for identity and self-determination.
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that poem. Could you maybe share a bit of it with us? I'm really curious to hear what made it so impactful.
Absolutely. Here's one of the most powerful lines. I am the masses of my people, and I refuse to be absorbed. You can just feel the strength and defiance in those words. It really captures the essence of the Chicano movement, this refusal to be assimilated, to be silenced, to be erased.
Wow, that gave me chills. You can almost hear people chanting it in the streets. It's interesting, we've been talking about the Chicano movement as this unified force, but when you look at it through the lens of history, you see there are actually different schools of thought on how to interpret it.
That's right. History is never a simple story, and the Chicano movement is no exception. Different historians have emphasized different aspects, offering a range of perspectives that I think really enrich our understanding.
So walk me through some of these different perspectives. What are some of the key debates among historians about the Chicano movement?
Well, you have what's called the progressive school, represented by historians like Carrie McWilliams. They focus on the long struggle for civil rights and labor justice, seeing the Chicano movement as part of this larger fight against systemic racism.
Right. It's like they're drawing a line from past struggles to the Chicano movement.
Exactly. Then you have the social history school historians like Vicky Ruiz. They emphasize the crucial role of community organizations and the often overlooked contributions of women. They highlight how these groups were instrumental in shaping the movement from the UFW to local activist networks.
Right. It's so important to remember the grassroots efforts, the everyday people who make these movements possible. What other perspectives are there?
We also have the revisionist school, which offers a more critical perspective. Historians like Jorge Mariscal, they question the romanticized notion of indigenous identity that was prevalent during the movement. They argue that the focus on militancy may have alienated potential allies and limited the movement's overall impact.
So they're raising some tough questions about the movement's strategies and their potential drawbacks. And it makes you think about the complexities of any social movement, right? Balancing radical change with building alliances.
Exactly. And finally, you have the post-colonial school, represented by historians like Juan Gonzales. They place the Chicano movement within this broader context of U.S. imperialism and its impact on Mexican Americans. They connect the activism we see in the movement to historical patterns of labor exploitation and cultural marginalization.
So they're taking a much wider view, placing the movement within a larger historical and geopolitical context. It's fascinating how each of these perspectives adds a different layer to our understanding.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that history is rarely one-sided. There are always multiple interpretations to consider.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've gone from the roots of the movement to these inspiring stories of those who fought for change. But I'm left wondering, what was the lasting impact? What did the Chicano movement actually achieve? And how does its spirit live on today?
Those are great questions, and ones we'll definitely explore as we continue our deep dive. I think we'll see those echoes of the movement, shaping conversations even today.
I'm ready to dig in. So let's talk legacy. What concrete achievements came out of the Chicano movement?
Well, one of the most significant and lasting impacts was increased political representation for Mexican Americans. at all levels of government.
Okay, so they're getting elected. That's a win. But how did that actually translate into change?
Well, having a seat at the table meant they could advocate for policies that really addressed the needs of their communities. They brought the concerns of Mexican Americans to the forefront, demanding a voice.
So they weren't just making up the numbers, they were actually wielding real power. And beyond politics, what other ripple effects did the movement have?
I think one of the most profound impacts was this surge in cultural pride and empowerment among Mexican Americans. The movement really instilled this sense of belonging, a shared history, a shared struggle.
You can really see that in the way they reclaimed the term Chicano. It became a source of pride, right? The celebration of their identity.
Exactly. And that newfound sense of self-worth, it had this ripple effect. We see it in higher educational attainment, a flourishing of Chicano art and literature, increased community involvement, this real sense of collective identity. It was a cultural awakening.
It's amazing how a movement can spark such a profound shift in perception. It's like they were rewriting the narrative about who they were and what they could achieve.
And they weren't afraid to challenge the status quo. They demanded to be seen and heard.
Speaking of demanding change, did the movement lead to specific policy changes, things that tangibly improved lives?
Oh, absolutely. The implementation of bilingual education programs across the country was a huge victory. They really pushed for culturally relevant education, helping to pave the way for students to learn in both English and Spanish.
It makes me think back to what you said earlier about the systemic discrimination, right? Language was often used as a barrier to exclude Mexican Americans. And bilingual education was a way to break down that barrier.
Exactly. It was about recognizing the value of linguistic diversity, creating a more inclusive system.
Beyond education, were there other areas where they pushed for policy change?
Well, the movement brought a lot of attention to the needs of Hispanic communities in areas like healthcare, housing, employment. They forced government agencies to acknowledge the inequalities and develop policies to address them.
So the Chicano movement wasn't just about fighting for Mexican Americans. It was about pushing for a more just society for everyone.
Absolutely. Their struggles resonated with other marginalized communities and helped fuel broader social change movements. They were fighting for a more inclusive America where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It's incredible how much they accomplished despite facing such huge challenges.
Their story is a testament to the power of collective action and that unwavering spirit, that refusal to give up.
Okay, so the height of the movement was in the 60s and 70s, but what about today? How does its spirit live on in the 21st century?
Well, the Chicano movement's legacy, it's woven into the fabric of today's social justice movements. It laid the groundwork for contemporary fights for immigrant rights, educational equity, economic justice.
I can see the connections, but can you give me some concrete examples? How is this legacy playing out today?
Absolutely. The fight for comprehensive immigration reform, for instance, it's deeply rooted in the Chicano movement's struggles for recognition and dignity for all people, regardless of immigration status, and the movement's emphasis on self-determination and community empowerment. It continues to inspire grassroots organizations working to improve the lives of Latinos across the country.
So the issues might have evolved, but the core values of the movement are still driving activism today.
That's right. It's about fighting for a more inclusive society where everyone has a chance to succeed.
It makes you wonder, are there lessons from the Chicano movement that could inform how we approach social justice issues today?
That's a great question, and I think one of the key lessons is the importance of building coalitions, working across communities, finding common ground.
Like the movement was strongest when they united with other groups who were also fighting for social justice, right?
Exactly. Another important lesson is the power of storytelling. The Chicano movement used art, literature, music, personal testimonies to humanize their struggles and connect with people.
Think about the impact of I Am Joaquin. It captured the spirit of the movement in such a powerful way.
Precisely. And it wasn't just poetry. They used murals, theater music to spread their message and inspire action. They understood that to create real change, you need to touch people's hearts as well as their minds.
Okay, we've covered so much in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about achievements, cultural impact, and how the legacy lives on. But I'm left with a lingering question. We've talked about the lessons we can learn, but what about the questions it raises for us today? What are some of those unresolved issues or challenges that continue to resonate in the 21st century?
That's a great way to frame it. I think one of the most pressing questions is how to bridge that gap between rhetoric and reality when it comes to social justice.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we talk a lot about equality and inclusion, but the reality is many marginalized communities are still facing systemic barriers.
So how do we move beyond just talking about change to actually creating meaningful and lasting change?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that the Chicano movement wrestled with as well.
Well, we've only got one part left in our deep dive. I'm hoping we can explore that question and maybe even find some answers.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap up our exploration.
Hmm.
Let's dive into those tough questions in our final part.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into the Chicano movement, and honestly, it's been more relevant than I even expected.
Yeah, it's not just history. It's,
Yeah.
it's really resonating with what's going on today.
In the last part, you mentioned that gap between the ideals of social justice and the reality on the ground. That really stuck with me. It's like we're still struggling with that same thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a tension that runs through a lot of these conversations, and it's especially relevant when we think about the legacy of the Chicano movement.
Mm-hmm.
They accomplished incredible things, political representation, cultural empowerment, real policy wins. But so many of those deep inequalities they were fighting against, they're still there.
Right, and that's what makes this conversation so important. It's not just about looking back, it's about how the past shapes the present and how we move forward.
Exactly. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I thought it'd be good to explore some of the key questions that have come up. Questions that I think you, as someone who's clearly engaged with this history, might be thinking about too.
Yeah, I'm all ears. Let's hear it.
Okay, so first we talked about how the Chicano movement reclaimed the term Chicano, right, turning it into a symbol of pride. But what happens when reclaiming a term actually leads to exclusion? We see this debate a lot within the Latinx community today. So some folks argue that Latinx is more inclusive of gender identities, while others feel like it erases that specific history of Chicanos.
It's a good point. It reminds us that language is always changing, and so the ways we define ourselves. I guess the question is, how do you honor those specific cultural identities while also creating this broader sense of unity?
Exactly. It's a tough conversation, right? One that needs nuance and sensitivity. And the Chicano movement, I think with its emphasis on both, cultural specificity and coalition building, gives us some good food for thought there.
Yeah, they were navigating that tension back then, finding ways to celebrate their Chicano identity while also working alongside other groups.
Right, and that actually leads to another question that's relevant today. How do you build effective coalitions across all these diverse communities? The Chicano movement had successes and setbacks. They found common ground with Black and Asian American activists on things like labor rights, but there were also tensions and disagreements.
So what's the takeaway there? How do you build those bridges without erasing the struggles and perspectives of different groups?
I think recognizing that solidarity doesn't mean uniformity. It's about finding common ground while respecting differences. It's about listening, learning, and understanding how these social justice issues are all connected.
And maybe it's also about being willing to have those tough conversations,
Yeah.
to acknowledge that there might be conflict even within coalitions.
Absolutely. And the Chicano movement, with all its internal debates and shifting strategies, it's a great example of that messy but essential work of building coalitions.
Okay, one last question that I've been thinking about. We talked a lot about political power, but how do you balance that with cultural change? Can you really have one without the other?
That's a great question. And I think the Chicano movement understood that it's not an either-or situation.
Yeah.
Political power is obviously essential for systemic change, but they also knew how important cultural transformation was, to shift hearts and minds.
So it's like you need both the political muscle and the cultural shift to really make lasting change.
Precisely. And we see that reflected in their work on things like bilingual education and celebrating Chicano art and literature. It wasn't just about laws and policies. It was about changing perceptions, challenging stereotypes.
I'm seeing how all of this connects to social justice movements today. How do you use your political voice effectively? How do you build cultural power? The Chicano movement, it's like a roadmap,
I think that's a great way to put it. The Chicano movement wasn't just a moment in history. It was a catalyst for change, a movement that continues to shape how we think about identity, justice, and collective action.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I'm walking away with a lot to think about, a deeper understanding of the struggles and the triumphs of the Chicano movement, so thank you for that.
My pleasure. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring this incredible legacy.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.